We're going to take a look now at Genesis chapter 20, running through to chapter 21, verse 6. And I've called the Sister Act 2, Back in the Habit. Now, I don't know whether I ever told you that joke about deja vu, and that's strange because I thought I had. But you wouldn't believe it, but Barbara and I recently went to a French restaurant named Deja Vu, and the waiter came to take our orders, and he looked at me and he said, "Don't I know you?" Now, if you've read Genesis chapter 12 and you've read right through the Abrahamic narratives and also Genesis 20, did you experience deja vu when Genesis 20, when you read that? Because back in Genesis 12, Abraham passed Sarah off as his sister when they were in Egypt, and now he does it again. So this is Sister Act 2. And the 1993 movie Sister Act 2 bore the subtitle Back in the Habit. So Abraham is truly back in the habit. He seems to call his wife his sister whenever he feels his life is under serious threat. So let's think about this whole matter of securing Sarah. Genesis 20 stresses that Abraham was a resident alien, a wanderer. And in verse 1 we read, Abraham moved on from there, that is away from the area where Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. Now, I don't know whether you've ever been to Rotorua in New Zealand. If so, you might feel like putting a peg on your nose. I mean, there are so many hot springs in Rotorua that you can never get away from the smell of sulphur. Now, Abraham was not interested in living with a peg on his nose, and he'd been close enough to smell sulphur after Sodom and the cities of the plain were destroyed, so no wonder he looked for somewhere else to stay. And so he heads south, but his options are limited because he has to avoid the deserts of Kadesh and Shur. Remember, he's got all this livestock that needs to be pastured and fed, and so he finds himself in Gerar near the southern border of the land of Canaan. Now, I don't know whether your life has ever been threatened or your family's been under threat. How did you try to protect yourself and your family? Barbara and I were living in a Muslim neighbourhood in Pakistan with 4 small children when the 1991 Gulf War broke out. And the Pakistani public supported Saddam Hussein. The newspaper articles were written inciting Pakistanis to kill Americans, and the police called in all of us missionaries, warning us of mass demonstrations against America. And they were quite honest with us and said, look, we just can't guarantee that we'll be able to control the crowds. So we were told to stay in our homes. Now, my wife and I were strangers in a foreign land. We had no way of defending ourselves. The only way I could provide any measure of security was arranging with our neighbours that we'd take refuge in their houses in the case of an attack. A Pakistani friend was prepared, if necessary, to hide us in his van and drive us to the Indian border. Now, nothing actually eventuated at the end of the day, and the crowds were kept under reasonable control. They did a big demonstration at the mission hospital, and that was the end of it. But we see in Genesis 19 that Lot was helpless to protect his family. And now in Philistine territory, Abraham feels much the same. His wife is now 90. Now, given people lived a lot longer, she may still have been a fine-looking woman, but this time there's no mention of her beauty. I mean, she is getting on. But sensible kings used marriage arrangements to forge mutually beneficial relationships with powerful people. And Abraham was a powerful man, with large herds and flocks and a sizable company of servants, even if he felt unable to defend himself against a king like Abimelech. Now, drug addicts and professional thieves steal our precious things. We ourselves have been burgled in the past, as have neighbours of ours. And the Australian Institute of Criminology informs us that people living in some of Sydney's inner and western suburbs are at least 40% more likely to have their house burgled than those in the rest of the state. We've now got security locks on all of our windows because of the threat of burglary. Now, most people can't afford sophisticated security systems, and so they might resort to trickery. For example, making it look like you've got an electronic alarm system installed when in fact you don't. Or when you go out, you might leave lights on and the radio or TV on to give the impression that there are still people at home. Anyway, Abraham sought to protect himself and his family by means of a clever trick, what you might call his sister act. And this is what he said to his wife, didn't he? He said, and when God, this is what we read anyway about his sister act in verse 13, and when God made me wander from my father's household, I said to her, this is how you can show your love to me. Everywhere we go, say of me, he is my brother. So that's what we see at the beginning of the chapter. You know, for a while, Abraham stayed in Gerar, and there Abraham said of his wife Sarah, she is my sister. So we really are dealing with sister act. Now, the local king, Abimelech, illustrates a common ancient aversion to adultery. However, a despot knows how to take a married woman as his wife and yet avoid adultery. It's really quite easy. Just kill the husband. Problem solved. Now, Abraham's policy is aimed at creating a security fence around Sarah and himself, and according to standard ancient cultural mores, any person wanting to take Sarah as his wife would approach the head of the family first. Now, in this case, Sarah's father's not around, it's her brother, who the king thinks is Abraham. So it's precisely this kind of protocol that Abraham is apparently trying to establish. In Abraham's mind, the need for such a policy is justified by what takes place. We read in verse 2, then Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent for Sarah and took her. Now, not a word is wasted here. It is as king that Abimelech does this. There is no by your leave here, no attempt to sit down with Abraham first and seek his permission, no attempt to negotiate. No, Abimelech is the king, and as such he does what he wants and he takes whatever he desires. He's decided he must have Sarah as his wife for whatever reasons, and so he simply sends for her and takes her. Now, other men may have observed the protocol of negotiating with the brother, but not Abimelech. He just takes what he wants. And Abraham's policy has evidently worked on many other occasions, but now for the second time it fails to provide him with the security fence that he needs. Now, if Pharaoh or Abimelech, we're thinking of Pharaoh back in Genesis chapter 12, or Abimelech here in this chapter, if either of them had felt it necessary to kill Abraham in order to take Sarah, would they have hesitated for a moment? And the ancient Jewish reader knows the answer immediately. And it's precisely this that makes all Abimelech's later protestations and posturing so amusing. We read from verse 3, but God came to Abimelech in a dream one night and said to him, you are as good as dead because of the woman you have taken. She is a married woman. And Abimelech is indignant, Lord, will you destroy an innocent nation? And these words hang in the air because they recall Abraham's prayer concerning Sodom and Gomorrah. There was nothing innocent about Sodom and Gomorrah, and there's been nothing innocent about Abimelech's behaviour. But he himself can't see that he has done anything wrong. And so he blusters, did he not say to me, she is my sister, and didn't she also say, he is my brother? I have done this with a clear conscience and clean hands. Now his words are highly amusing and hypocritical to the ancient Jewish reader. Are we really to believe that this man would have kept his mitts off Sarah had he known she was married to Abraham? No way. There is no fear of God in this place. Abimelech has just acted like a despot and has simply taken Sarah without bothering about standard cultural practices. He would not have hesitated for a moment to kill Abraham in order to claim his wife. Now God humours Abimelech. Then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know that you did this with a clear conscience, as I've kept you from sinning against me. That is why I did not let you touch her. Which is what's meant by sinning against me at that point. In other words, I'll accept this much, that you didn't know that she was a married woman, and I want you to be perfectly clear about one thing. There is absolutely no way I'm going to let you lay your hands on her. And so God adds, now return the man's wife. Now, what Abimelech needs to realise is that he has taken away the wife of a man who is very special to God. Because God says, now return the man's wife, for he is a prophet. Now we might think back to the way Genesis 15 began. The opening formula of that chapter is this: the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision, which is very much like many of the prophetic writings, isn't it? It implicitly identifies Abram as a prophet, and God now makes this explicit. A biblical prophet is not merely God's mouthpiece and a mediator between God and people. God gives his prophet the power of life and death. And in effect, God says to Abimelech, don't you dare play games with Abraham. You little upstart have been treating his life and that of his wife and family as though they were in your hands. Well, I'm turning this around. Your life and the lives of your family are now in his hands. Only if Abraham prays for you is there any possibility of life for you. If you refuse to return his wife to him, then he will not pray for you and you will die. Now we must remember here that it was Abraham's prayer for Lot that saved his life. And Abraham is presented yet again as the man who stands between men and life and death. So ancient despots like Abimelech had to learn to treat Abraham with enormous respect. And in the same way, no matter how self-sufficient you may feel, don't make the mistake of trivializing Jesus and feeling that you can do what you want with what belongs to him. Jesus holds your life or your death in his hands, and he does the same with my life, my death. And he determines when we will draw our next breath, and whether we'll draw our next breath or not. He determines where we will spend eternity, whether that be in heaven or hell, or with him in his presence, or separated from his presence. Now Abraham later tells the king of his first impressions when he came to Gerar. I said to myself, there is surely no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. And we live in a society in which few people have any notion of what it means to fear God. C.S. Lewis observed, amiable agnostics will talk cheerfully about man's search for God. To me, as I then was, they might as well have talked about the mouse's search for the cat. As soon as everyone is up the next morning, Abimelech tells his officials what has happened. And when Abraham first arrived in Gerar, there was no fear of God to be seen. But now these people know that the God of Abraham is someone to be feared. But Abimelech won't accept any personal blame for this situation. He calls Abraham in and he treats him as though all the wrong was on Abraham's side. What have you done to us? How have I wronged you that you have brought such great guilt upon me and my kingdom? You have done things to me that should not be done. I mean, what blindness and self-righteousness and hypocrisy. Abimelech had no right to take Sarah, even if he had not known she was Abraham's wife. Abimelech has lost face, and the way to regain face and his standing is by making out that Abraham is fully responsible for this situation. Abraham, however, explains that he had very solid and legitimate reasons for acting in the way that he had. There was no fear of God in Gerar when he arrived, and he was telling no lie when he said Sarah was his sister, because she was indeed his half-sister. Abraham had used a perfectly valid security trick. The problem does not lie in Abraham's strategy, but in Abimelech's despotism. On the other hand, Abraham, as we can see, was not fully trusting in God to protect him, but still relying too much upon his own devious strategy. Now Jim had been a regular churchgoer, but he was now in hospital fighting for his life. And it was touch and go whether he would live or whether he would die, and the family called their pastor to be with them at this time. And as the pastor stood next to the bed, Jim's condition appeared to deteriorate rapidly, and he motioned frantically for something to write on. And the pastor lovingly handed him a pen and a piece of paper, and Jim used his last bit of energy to scribble a note, and then he died. And the pastor thought it best not to look at the note at that time, so he placed it in his jacket pocket. And at the funeral, as he was finishing his eulogy, he realised that he was wearing the same jacket that he was wearing when Jim died. And he said to the congregation, you know, Jim handed me a note just before he died. Well, I haven't looked at it yet, but knowing Jim, I'm sure there's a word of inspiration there for us all. So he opened up the note and he read, "Hey, you're standing on my oxygen tube." Now Abimelech's life and the lives of his family are in Abraham's hands. Abraham controls Abimelech's oxygen supply. The chapter begins with Abimelech trying to take away from Abraham his most precious possession. And it ends very similar to Genesis 12 in many respects, but it ends with Abimelech enriching Abraham further with yet more sheep, cattle and slaves, and with returning his dear wife to him, plus giving 1,000 shekels of silver. He's desperate to be on the right side of Abraham because he and his family will only live if Abraham prays for them, and Abimelech is fearful that Abraham will not pray for him. And so the chapter begins with Abraham's vulnerability to the despotic Abimelech, but it ends with Abimelech being like putty in Abraham's hands. So we've talked about securing Sarah. Well, we need to think about securing Isaac too, don't we, in this chapter, because Genesis 20, it ends with a reminder to Abraham of the power of God, and God clearly promised to give a son to Abraham and Sarah, and God gives Abraham great grounds for confidence that he will fulfill his promise. He gets Abraham to pray for the opening of the wombs of Abimelech's wife and the wombs of his slave girls. So Abraham prays and God answers. And now Abraham knows that there can be no doubt that God controls the wombs of all women. It is God who enables a woman to be pregnant. God will fulfill his promise to Abraham. A mother asked, "Should I have a baby after 40? No, she was told, 40 children is enough. Should Sarah have a baby after 90? Well, no. Well, humanly speaking. But that's what happened, as we learn from verse 1. And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did unto Sarah as he had spoken. So this is the Lord's second visit. The first visit is recorded in Genesis 18 when God visited as a human-looking angel and promised Sarah that he would return at the appointed time the following year when Sarah would have a son. And that time has now come. But this time there is no physical appearance of God. Paul speaks of this in Galatians chapter 4. At that time the son born in the ordinary way persecuted the son born by the power of the Spirit. So Genesis 21 does not explicitly speak of Isaac being born by the power of the Spirit, but as Paul recognises, when God visited Sarah, he came to her in the Spirit. It is God who enables her to conceive and give birth to Isaac. And what a wonderful God our God is, as she holds laughter, that is Isaac, in her hands, that's what his name means. She cries out, "God has brought me laughter." Now the experience of God-given joy through the birth of her son was completely outside Sarah's control, just as protecting his wife was outside of Abraham's control. We live in a society which is quite unlike most societies in our world, a society that gives us so much freedom that we are deluded into thinking that we are in control of our own lives. In reality, we are just as incapable as Abraham of protecting ourselves and those we love. I called this chapter, Sister Act 2, Back in the Habit. Let's get back in the habit. The habit of ever remembering that Jesus is our risen Lord, who possesses all authority, total control in heaven and earth, and therefore full control of what happens in your life and mine. And he is the one who promises us, as his followers, "Surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." Amen.